Okay. Welcome to JWA's book club. We are so excited today to be here with the author Tova Mirvis. It's particularly exciting for me because Tova is a friend as well as a fellow Newtonian, and we're really excited to have her here with us.
Thank you.
So Tova, I really loved this book, Visible City, and one of the reasons why I immediately thought about it as a good pick for JWA's book club is because our mission at the Jewish Women's Archive is really about expanding the narrative to include stories that have been left out or have not been heard. And your book, which really plays on what's visible on the surface and what's hidden underneath, feels very connected to that theme. So I was wondering if while you were writing Visible City, did you start with a sense of particular experiences that you wanted to give voice to?
I started off with a few different things. Really, the book began for me right after we moved to Newton and from the Upper West Side of Manhattan. And I guess to put it politely, I hated Newton very, very much, hated just about everything about it. And I missed that experience of walking in the city and that feeling that every time you went outside, you were kind of bombarded with other people, strangers usually. And I always had this sense that these stories were just passing by, these fascinating lives contained inside these strangers' bodies, and you're so close to them yet have so little access. And so that's what really sparked the idea for the book. And I wasn't much of a voyeur. I think I wish I was at the time, but I was also interested in how that same experience happened when you were inside a New York City apartment where you could just gaze out at this array of other people's lives and catch little glimpses. And I think as a novelist, what interests me most is that question of what's on the inside versus what's on the outside. I felt like just like buildings have facades, we all wear our brick and mortar facades when we're out in public, but I'm always interested in those private spaces that don't often get talked about or don't always get a chance to see the light of day.
I really loved, it was a very familiar idea, that sense of like there are people that you see all the time in New York, but you don't know who they are, or even people you might recognize in one context, but not in another. When I was a kid, we lived in New York, we lived on the Upper West Side, and we lived in Columbia housing, and we would see these graduate students who lived in the apartment building across from us, and they were always in their underwear. But it was this very funny thing that my dad used to always say, oh, well, we would never recognize them if we saw them on the street because they'd be wearing clothes. And I don't think they could realize that, that we could see them.
Right, as long as no one knows who you're watching, you're fine. I'm always fascinated by this sort of anonymous sense of intimacy where I can see the most private details of your life, but if I don't actually know you, it's fine. And for all the years I lived in this apartment, I never wanted to buy curtains because it seemed like it was silly to invest in something that we were only going to use for a year. And then it kept being year after year. But that sense that you get moments when you don't know each other, you almost get more access than when you do know each other. And that feeling and I would live that way also. I thought, oh, well, who cares what people see, But once I moved to Newton, to the suburbs, I instantly felt like, oh, I need curtains. People I know can see me. And that changes everything.
Right, exactly. Like, can you actually put the face with the person? And I love those moments at the beginning of the book when Nina realizes that she has some connection with the people that she has been watching, and she meets them in real life and figures out some of those connections. Although some of the connections actually don't get made until the very end when Claudia figures out who Jeremy is. So it's kind of an interesting process.
Right, thank you. There was that sense of it. I'm interested in how we see people and we construct stories. And I think we do it not just through windows, but you see someone in line in the grocery store or driving past you. And I always had that moment of, what's really going on there? Or what else is happening that we don't see? And I think there's always that interplay between imagining strangers' lives and then people we actually know. And I've had that experience many times where I think, oh, no one can see me. And I realize, oh, that person I just passed and honked at actually is a friend. And that sense that we live, I think we're private all the time, but we're actually in public, and that interplay and how the shock, I think the thrill, there's a tantalizing thrill to realizing, oh, I know her. I know something else about her, as if we're trying to sort of secretly extract information about the people right around us.
Mm-hmm. So much of this book is also about motherhood. And so I'm curious how your own experiences of being a mother, both with little kids in the city and with bigger kids living in the suburbs, informed your work in this book?
And that was really one of the earliest pieces of Visible City for me. I wrote it right after we moved to the Boston area, and I also had 2 young children at the time. And I felt like I wanted to write a book that really spoke to my experience of what it felt like. There were already hundreds of books I could have chosen from if I wanted to read what I should feel like or what I should do. And as a young mother with my first son, who was now 16, I felt like I could have read, books that had opinions on every single moment of our day, all of which were conflicting. And I emerged from that feeling of early motherhood only anxious, only certain that whatever I was doing was the wrong way. And I felt this intense pressure. We had gone to baby massage class and baby gym, and I had baked, cookies with him, and we had done finger painting, and I was also trying to write a novel, somehow squeezed in these, and music played constantly, but it was never enough. And it was a feeling that really tormented me, this sense that however hard I worked, it was never good enough, because there was this imagined expectation of how other mothers did it, the so-called perfect mothers. I think we appoint other people, whether they are these ways or not, to be those sort of arbiters of what we should be. And I lived, in the early mother years with that sense, that swirling feeling that I wasn't, a so-called stay-at-home mother because I was writing, but I wasn't really a working mother either. I didn't have a place I went to work. I worked from home, and I was sort of caught between those worlds. And I felt like I wanted to write a book that spoke to that anxiety and that sense that there was some other person who knew better, and that way, again, that we look at other people. And I wanted to think about a lot of ways that motherhood became so much part of how I identified myself, where my son was always a kid who had many imaginary friends. His imaginary friends had imaginary friends, and we lived in these multiple layers of reality. But I thought a lot about fantasy, and I feel like adults have their own equivalents of imaginary friends, and we create fantasy in the same way in order to take us through our days. And I wanted to sort of look at the parallel versions for women when they are home, and that sense of loneliness also, which I felt like was really important to me in writing the book, feeling that you can gaze out at life but not quite participate in it.
Right. The book has, speaking of the concept of fantasy, the book really has a kind of fantastical ending. And I was curious whether you had ever written anything like that before, or whether you knew from the beginning that you were going to end the story with this kind of surreal piece.
I didn't know. I mean, part of the reason the book took 10 years to write was I had no idea how to end it. I just felt in this complete muddle of, and then what happens to them? And I would sort of feel like, I don't know. I have no idea what happens. And I wrote an earlier version of the book, and over years kept writing making the same mistake again and again as a writer, where I tried to end the book with the feeling that Nina can look out at all these other people. She can sort of imagine these other people's lives, but she always stayed safely inside her own square. And there was a line from the original draft that sort of torments me sometimes, where I wanted to end the book with the feeling of, that it was enough to travel just on the rails of her own imagination, that you could stay inside. And I think I learned from writing the book that that's not true, that it's not enough to stay inside that small square of a life that felt too small for her. And so I knew very late in the writing, around year 9, let's say, that she needed to go outside. I felt like the push of the book had to be that we all eventually find ways to free ourselves from these squares, or I hope we do. And so I knew I needed her to be outside in the city. And so I guess I toyed with the idea of fantasy. I was interested in again, these imaginary friends and our own fantasies and escape fantasies, which certainly, on the many, many hours of pushing kids on swings or bathing children, I think I harbored many versions of those escape fantasies of, I'm going to get up right now and walk out this door, or I'm going to Paris, I'm going here, and ways that we use escape, I think sometimes very ironically, to not go anywhere at all. And I wanted her to have that sense that the whole city can open up to you if you jump, if you take that step outside, which is sort of where I ended up with the zoo. And I also find the Central Park Zoo this bizarre thing that in the middle of Manhattan there are polar bears. It seems, the reality of it seems completely surreal.
Right. I have a question from one of our participants, Miriam, who asks, how did you learn about the stained glass windows of John Lafarge? And why did you decide to use them as a motivating factor for the characters in Visible City?
that was actually one of my favorite parts of researching the book. And it's always interesting how a novel can take you to interests you didn't know you have. But I was really interested in windows to start with. I was focused on windows we see through, and windows with curtains and windows without curtains. And then I got interested from someone who had an interest in Tiffany glass, and I went to a Tiffany exhibit at the Met. And I always felt like beforehand that I wasn't interested. I didn't like stained glass. I think I'd only seen it in dark churches in Europe, and I felt like this is not a form of art that speaks to me at all. And then I went to this exhibit, and I realized that the difference between seeing stained glass in the dark and seeing it in the light is vast. And to see stained glass with the light streaming through is to see colors come alive. And so I fell in love with stained glass sort of as a whole. And then when I started doing some reading, it was interesting to me that John Lafarge was someone whose surfaces were described as being much more dappled or bumpy or crusted, or he had none of the neatness and perfection of Tiffany. And I felt like I was sort of writing about that sense in life, life that, looking for life that was dappled in that way, as opposed to the sort of more smooth, perfect lines. And I also, someone told me about the connection between John Lafarge and his son, who developed the New York City subway station, which I also had as a piece in the book. I wasn't sure what I was going to do with it. And I think a lot of writing a novel feels like spreading out all your puzzle pieces on the table and just hoping that somehow they're going to connect. And those moments when they do are thrilling. I mean, that's where the real pleasure of writing is, where all of a sudden they do align, or you see a thematic link between one idea and another, and that feeling of, oh, the book is actually going to come together in some form, one way or another.
Right, that somehow you're moving towards something that you didn't even know was there, but kind of unfolds before you, even though you're ostensibly the actor putting the pieces together.
Exactly. It's a feeling of, oh, I'm not just making a mess on the page. There's actually some order is being created, even if I can't see it as I'm writing it.
Right. I was wondering whether you visited any of those ghost subway stations as part of the research too.
I did. I'd like to pretend that I snuck out in the middle of the night and did something really cool, but the MTA, the New York City Subway Authority, actually gives tours twice a year of the ghost station.
Oh, cool.
I went with 10 other people, and I sort of felt like, I know why I'm here. I'm doing research for the novel, but why are you here? And it was fascinating that people have this love of the subway and love of these ghost stations and these hidden New York City spaces. And we got to go on a special little train to the station, and I thought that I would just be interested, as with writing down notes so I could describe it later. I was so moved by it. I was to stand in this space that was once this bustling thoroughfare and is completely sealed off now, and no one has access. It really felt like being given some little piece of New York City that was mine alone. And the other thing is, you can now see, if you're ever looking for something fun to do, if you get on the 6th train in New York City and go downtown and stay on it past the last stop, it's now legal to stay on as it makes the turn. And you just see it for 2 or 3 seconds, but it's it almost feels like a dream. You feel like, did I imagine those arches? Did I imagine all those tiles? And it's just this beautiful little glimpse of something that most people don't get to see.
So cool. Obviously, this is a very New York novel, and I'm wondering whether you were inspired by other New York novels, and if so, what are some of your favorites?
I definitely thought a lot about how this book felt essential to. It felt like New York was essential to the book. I felt like maybe other cities have this sense of people watching, but for me, it was really a way to pour my homesickness for New York into the book. And there are a bunch of books I read that I loved about New York. I love a trilogy by Cheryl Mendelson. The first book is called Morningside Heights, and she chronicles this neighborhood. I guess the books came out about 12 or 13 years ago, and I felt like it really contained that sense of what it feels like to be in the city. Books that really capture that sense of people all around you. I also read essays by Philip Lopate about walking in New York, and this feeling of nowhere else has this feeling that when you step outside, anything can happen to you. And so I felt like New York was crucial to me in the book. It felt like the city was sort of driving my interest in the book. And over the years in which I was, all these years which I was sort of stuck in the book or felt like I didn't know the way out of it, I would go back to New York, and just being there would give me one more push to keep going with the book.
Very cool. I have a question from another participant. Sharon asks, you've said that you were raised a modern Orthodox feminist in Tennessee. Can you tell me about what feminism meant to you growing up and how, if at all, it conflicted with being Orthodox?
Okay. Well, I guess, for many years I would get a question, at a book talk. It seemed like the first question I always got was, what was the reaction to your first book in Memphis? And the second question is, often, are you still Orthodox? And for years I sort of played it as a joke. I would say, I consider myself a liberal, feminist, pluralist, Orthodox Jew, and sort of aware of myself of that weird stew of words together. And growing up, I don't think I certainly thought of myself as a feminist growing up. I'm not sure that I knew that word for many, many years. I thought of myself as being modern Orthodox. And so that opened the gate to be feminist. But I felt that tension always, that sense that there was a feeling of being at war with my own self in some ways, that sense that, we were supposed to not be bothered by the blessings the boys said. We were supposed to be past the point of being bothered by a blessing a boy would say, thanking me for not making me a woman. And we were supposed to not really care that the girls in the third grade class, myself included, had the instinct to say our equivalent blessing in these soft little voices, that to speak in the softest voice was the most feminine or ladylike. And to sort of know that it was bothersome, but not to actually be bothered because you weren't supposed to be bothered. And there was this feeling that it couldn't be sexist, so you must be feeling it wrong if it seemed sexist to you. And I lived very often with that sort of swirling gap. And in high school, I felt that even more so, that sense. I went to a school called the Yeshiva of the South, where there were 6 girls in my class. And it was sort of schizophrenic in many ways, because on one hand, we were being groomed. It felt like Orthodox Jewish finishing school. We were being groomed to host mother-daughter luncheons and fashion shows. And I made my big revolt by refusing to be in the show Destiny, an inspirational evening of song and dance for the women of Memphis. And this feeling of, it was not inspirational, I should just say. Somewhere out there, there's a video floating of this show, which someone will find and sell for many dollars on eBay one day. But that feeling of, I don't want to do this, but I'm supposed to do this. And I'm supposed to be a certain way, but I can't be that way. And that tension for me really informed my growing up, that feeling that there was one way to be, and there were hundreds of ways not to be, one way to be good and so many ways to be bad. And to comply with the rules was to be good, and to be good was the central value, and to be nice and sweet and kind, and that whole group of words that go along with it. And it wasn't until I left Memphis to go to college that I began to understand that there were words for these feelings, and there were groups and movements, and there was obviously a much larger understanding of that feeling that felt almost shameful inside me to have, that somehow I was bursting out of this world.
One of our participants, Allison, asks about this kind of shift from your first 2 books, which were much more kind of explicitly Jewish, to Visible City, which is less explicitly Jewish. And she asks what prompted that shift. And I would add on to that question whether you see Visible City as a Jewish book.
I think when I started writing Visible City, I don't think I ever intentionally set out to say this is not going to be a Jewish book. I remember, joking at one point that I didn't think I had any more descriptions of Shabbat left inside of me. I felt like I had kind of used all those, but I never felt like, oh, I'm writing a non-Jewish book. It was never an explicit decision. I knew that the things I was thinking about, watching people and motherhood, weren't centrally located in the Jewish world necessarily, but I sort of set out, and my assumption always was, given that this is my book, this book is going to take a right turn somewhere and land in, somehow it's going to end up in Orthodox Jewish Memphis. I don't know how, but this book is going to go that way. And, the fact that it didn't was surprising to me. I felt like there was one little piece where Jeremy had an Orthodox background. And that to me, in some ways, it felt like that was me writing towards my own comfort space, or what I know well, or my own sort of questioning always. But I think by the end, when there were more churches than synagogues in the book, and where, the stained glass windows, many of Lafarge's works are in churches, I felt it was surprising to me as well. And yet, even so, even though the subject matter is not ostensibly Jewish or overtly so, I felt like it was Jewish in 2 ways. One was that my assumption of many of my main characters was that they were Jewish. And my editor and I had a conversation towards the end of the editing process where I asked her, do you think we should explicitly say, Nina is Jewish, and Claudia is Jewish, and Leon is Jewish, and Emma is Jewish? And my editor said, you have an academic, a therapist, and a lawyer on the Upper West Side of Manhattan. Don't worry. Nina is Jewish. And I felt like it was sort of Jewish in that way. And the other way that I feel like the book is Jewish is sort of the theme of watching people. And for me, certainly that feeling of being watched is central to my own Jewish upbringing and experience. My first novel, The Ladies' Auxiliary, is all about a group of women who watch someone else, but that preoccupation with how others see us and how we see ourselves when we're aware of other people watching us, to me comes so much from growing up in a very small Orthodox Jewish community. And that I feel like that is where sort of my own Jewish lens becomes evident in this book.
Yeah, I thought the theme of voyeurism was a really interesting one, and particularly how you kind of juxtapose it with action. So like there's watching and then there's kind of doing. And I was wondering whether you thought at all about writing and sort of where that fits into it, like whether you see writing in some ways as an act of voyeurism, since it's sort of about observation.
Right. I felt very much that sense of alignment with Nina in many ways, but certainly with her watching. And even though I was not an actual voyeur, you know, I needed contact lenses, which I didn't know for all the years I lived in Manhattan. So I couldn't even see that well. I didn't know that if I had just put glasses on, I would have had a much better view. But I feel like writing is all about voyeurism. I feel like the writer is a voyeur everywhere. And that sense that always gazing at other people and, you know, asking this question of, you know, what does it feel like to be someone else? And I feel like that is the driving question in fiction writing. Can I imagine myself out of the constraints of my own life and my own stuff into someone else's world? Can I sort of jump out of myself? And that curiosity about other people, I think, is what the voyeur also seeks, this sense, not just the titillating, and people think of voyeurism as being in search of the titillating. And yes, it's, you know, it's there, but it's, I think really that we're interested in seeing people in unscripted moments. I think we want to see people beyond the sort of happy, always happy Facebook post and the I'm great, how are you, the sort of way we battle each other with our my life is perfect, you know, how about yours? Those moments where we're, you know, trying to present the public facade. I think that there's such a hunger for someone to say it like it really feels. And I think for me, writing is all about that. I feel like if you're not going to be honest, then why even do it?
I think this also relates in some ways to one of the themes that we explore a lot at JWA, which is role models, and how important it is to have models of who we want to become, which is sort of maybe the flip side of feeling like people are watching, or you're watching other people and you're given these models that are kind of rigid, but also the ways in which role models can be really kind of expanding of the possibilities. We often say here, if you can see it, you can be it. So that there's some kind of, you know, ability that opens up when you see something that models for you what it could be. So I was wondering whether you have any particular literary role models or any authors that you kind of idolized as you were growing up.
Yeah, I've had both role models who I idolized from afar and then mentors. And, you know, one writer who I think of, actually two writers come to mind. The first mentor I had is a writer who I love her work as well, Mary Gordon, when I was in college. And she was when I really first started writing. And what I really admired about her was her plain spokenness. She was not a beat around the bush person. She said it like it was. And that fact that you could say it like it was, you didn't have to sort of speak in the way I was raised, where everything is cloaked with a smile and layer, you know, what you meant is hidden 5 layers down, and you had to kind of figure out how to excavate that. But everything was said with, you know, a big smile all the time. And she actually gave me the best writing advice I ever had, where she said to me, you know, I was a senior in college complaining that I had no time to write and I was busy. I don't even know what, but, you know, I laugh at that earlier version of myself. But she said to me, if you're a writer, then you write. And it was just so clear to me that you could, by the force of your own will, you could make something happen. You could sit yourself down and do it and put aside the busy, we're all busy, but that sense of being determination to do something. The other role model whose work also was really transformational for me is Rebecca Goldstein, who has been a mentor for many, many years. And I recently reread The Mind-Body Problem, which is a book I read in graduate school when she was my teacher. And I had one of those moments of, oh yes, you know, one of those books you want to roll around in and just feel like this speaks so much to my own experience. And I think having her as someone who has been a mentor over the years, is someone who's opened up a world for me, who said, you know, you can be different. You can be someone else. You don't have to be the way you were raised. And you can find those role models in lots of different places and take them for yourselves and hold on to them as visions of what else is possible for you.
Yeah, I can see the connection between your writing and that. And both of you, I think, are people who in your writing show kind of how you can step out of the world that you came from, but also how much you're grounded in it in terms of exploring some of those themes and thinking about, you know, how much that initial community kind of shapes the way that you are responding to it and to the world. And
right, it's like you leave and you never leave in so many ways. And one of the things that I don't think I knew when I started writing Visible City, but came to realize was, you know, years and years after sort of going in circles, was that the book was really about change and about the exhilarating possibilities of change, but also what is hard and what is lost in change, that all change comes with a loss. And I wanted to think about it in the city itself, where over these questions of historical preservation, when do you save a building because it has historical value, and when do you knock it down? And it's never a simple proposition, and both ways come with loss. And I was interested in how that plays out for people as well, that sense that you just walk away from a past is not, I think that's a very fairy tale version. It's enormously complicated to change. And all the characters in the book, and I include myself, you know, in my own life, that sense of change is those places where you have to decide, you know, do I want to knock something down? You know, it's hard work and it's hard to lose something, but yet that's the way you make way for new things. And I think that, you know, I go back to that question a lot in a lot of my writing now, that sense of, you know, what is the loss in the necessary path forward?
right. And it's easier maybe to escape in your mind,
right,
and less in real life.
Right. Fantasy, you know, everything can be perfectly untrammeled. You can just, you know, walk off, but that gap, or the, you know, the conflict between the fantasy version of the reality is very interesting to me. That sense of, oh, this isn't quite what I imagined it to be in our lives. And I think those moments where fantasy meets reality are really rich for fiction always. That sense of, this is not what I expected. And then what do you do about it?
I loved the moment where Maurice, the little boy's imaginary friend, just departs for the country. And how easy that was. Oh, he left from the subway station. And there's kind of this panic of like, oh my God, we lost him. Are we going to need to find him? But, you know, because he's imaginary, he can just head off somewhere else.
Right. It's like, how many times have all of us wanted to be that imaginary character? It's just, he lived here now and now he's gone. And that's essentially a fantasy of departures, or the escape fantasy. I felt like, you know, that, you know, concocting them in moments where you know you're not going anywhere, but how powerful they can be, really, that sense of, I could just get in my car and go.
Right. We have one more question from Lynn, who says that Visible City is your third book, and what did you learn from the first and second that helped you write it?
I learned a lot from it. One of the things I've learned with each of the books is that each book is sort of its own mess. It's its own problem to deal with. Maybe it's like children, right? Each child comes with its own. You think you're an expert after the first child, and then the second child behaves completely differently. And you kind of have some experience, but you really have to make it new each time. And I think one of the things I learned with Visible City was, I learned that it takes a long time. I learned that it's an exhausting process. And I learned patience. I learned that feeling that I so badly wanted to be done with Visible City after 5 years, after 6 years, but I wasn't. And I learned that you just have to wait it out, you know, to work hard, to sort of, I feel like I was banging my head against it for years, but that feeling that you can't rush it, you can't finish it before it's willing to be done, and that sense almost of wrestling a book to the ground. And for me, Visible City was probably the book where I learned the most as a writer. I learned how to stay with something. I learned how to abide by immense frustration, or that fear, I think, that looms over many projects of, is this good? Will I ever be done? Why am I doing this? What other career could I possibly have? That sort of black cloud of worry that hangs over an unfinished work. And I think with Visible City, I learned how to push myself past my own comfort zone, to sort of free myself from that voice that says, oh, you can't write that, or you can't say that, or you shouldn't do that. That's not nice. To be willing to push past that, and to realize that you have to, you know, characters have to be put in danger. You know, all characters, and writing has to go to those places that are uncomfortable, and really to be willing to push myself to those places.
Yeah, one of the things I was noticing as I was rereading Visible City to prepare for today, I couldn't remember what the time frame was of the book, like how long of a time period it covered. And I was sort of surprised to see that it actually wasn't very much time. And it made me think about that process of change and how there are these, the characters when we meet them have clearly been stuck for a long time. And then over a relatively short period of time of just a few months, a lot changes for them and they kind of reach this breaking point and start to kind of break out of the patterns that they've been trapped in. And yet the book ends before they've made any real big changes. I mean, they've sort of set the stage for that to happen, but you're sort of left knowing that those changes are going to happen going forward. And that also felt very real and like made me think about the way that progress happens. That's something I've definitely found in my own work and writing and research, that you can be chugging along and it feels like you're not getting anywhere. And then something shifts and it takes you a much greater distance in a short period of time. And then again, you have to then kind of gear up for that next phase of change.
I thought about how you can be pushing an enormous stone uphill for so long. And there's that moment, like right as you crest over the top, where you feel like all of a sudden you can speed up. And I wanted the characters, I guess they all in one way or another were stuck. They all, when you meet them, they're all kind of inside their own squares of their lives. Everyone is feeling that sense of being cooped up or stuck. And I feel like the book is the moment. I wanted to sort of set the book at that moment where everyone is sort of serves as a catalyst for one another, or people are pushed just right over that edge, but not before the stone sort of falls down the hill. But that's just sort of snapshot, that moment where change is just around the corner. I thought a lot about the title of Grace Paley's short story, Enormous Changes at the Last Moment. The sense that you think everything is going to be a certain way, and then everything, that just that title conveys that sense of, and then it all changes.
Mm-hmm. So our last question, I would love for you to tell us a little bit about your new book project, which I know is a memoir after having published 3 novels. So I'm curious to hear about how you're finding memoir writing different from writing fiction, and whether you're exploring similar kinds of themes in this next project.
I am writing a memoir, which it took me about a year before I could say that word without getting immensely nervous or sort of saying, well, I'm writing a nonfiction book that's sort of about myself. And if someone would say, you mean a memoir? I was like, yes, I mean a memoir.
Oh yes, there is a word for that.
Right. I was like, I know, I just can't say that word yet, but I've practiced it where I can say I'm writing a memoir. And it's strange, it's such a different process than novel writing, where in a novel, the whole question is, what can I make up? What can I make happen here? Or who can I create these characters to be? Here I know, for better or worse, I know the story, I know the characters. It's more a question of, how do I tell it? How do I structure it? How do I convey it? And the book was really inspired by an essay I wrote that was in the New York Times about a year ago about my Orthodox divorce ceremony. And it was sort of a piece that I felt very, very anxious about putting out in the world. And sort of take your own most personal, private, anxious stew and send it out for every person you know to read and comment on it. And I was sort of off the grid when it came out, and then came home to just hundreds of emails from people from a vast range of different walks of life, so sharing with me their own stories of either divorce or religious transformation or change of any kind. And that was sort of my tipping point to deciding I was going to write a memoir, really about the question of how you leave, having grown up Orthodox and wrestling with the questions I mentioned, how you decide, right before your 40th birthday that you're going to live a different life, that the person you feel yourself to be is not the person you are on the outside, and wanting the inside and the outside to better align. And so deciding to not be Orthodox anymore and what that means. And I'm really interested in exploring questions of, can you leave? You can leave in action, but what is the imprinting of thought? Can you leave the thought? I think that religion is so intertwined with childhood and family that I don't think we don't shed these things or leave them so easily. And I'm interested also in what I see as a trade-off sometimes between freedom and belonging, and to look at the loss that comes with choosing this, but also what is gained. And it's a book that I've been working on for, I guess, about a year now. And actually just this morning, I printed out the first draft of it to give to a friend of mine who's going to read it. And sort of the first printout is always like scary and exhilarating. It's sort of like, what have I made? What have I done here? And it still is in process, but it's actually I have a deadline for it in December. So that is it's sort of a good motivating force to get to the next draft now.
Right. Well, thank you so much for sharing so much with us, both in your writing and here today. And I think, there are so many ways that your story and these questions of belonging and of talking about the things that are not often articulated are really important to how we see ourselves here at the Jewish Women's Archive. And we're so glad to be in conversation with you. And thank you to you and to all the people who are watching for being patient throughout the technical difficulties this morning. We had a little trouble with our YouTube connection, but we're so glad to talk with you and to hear about your work. And we can't wait for the next one to come out.
Thank you so much.
Thanks. Take care.